Have you ever felt like the world is kind of on the edge?
Oh, yeah.
Like everything needs a total reset?
Yeah.
Well, today we're taking a deep dive into some ideas that look at exactly that.
Oh, cool.
We're going to be looking at how communities can take charge and how faith plays a role in all this, especially in the Islamic world. We're going to see if it can offer like a path forward. We've got some awesome academic papers lined up.
Really?
Yeah, we're talking degrowth, the Hizmet movement, even the experiences of white converts to Islam in Canada. It's a lot.
It is, what's really fascinating to me is that these ideas, as different as they sound,
Yeah.
all come back to the power of community.
Right.
You know, tackling those huge crises we're all facing.
Yeah.
Like climate change, social inequality. It's a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the papers we have by Al-Khatiri, it really lays out our current situation, and it's not pretty.
No.
No, he argues that this constant push for economic growth, it's just not sustainable.
Yeah.
And on top of that, all our efforts to fight climate change, they're just not enough.
Oh.
He even uses the Roman Empire as an example, saying that even the most powerful systems can crumble. It makes you think, are we headed for the same fate?
Well, Al-Khatiri's point is we need a complete change in how we think.
Okay.
He talks about degrowth. But that doesn't mean being against progress.
Right.
It's more about rethinking what progress actually means. It's about moving away from just consuming stuff all the time
Okay.
and moving towards a simpler life, a more localized life.
Yeah.
So think community gardens instead of big lawns.
Oh, yeah.
Or sharing tools with your neighbors instead of everyone buying the same thing.
Makes sense.
And putting locally made products first.
So it's kind of like hitting the reset button, right?
Yeah.
We're focusing on well-being and connections instead of just getting more and more things.
Exactly. And here's the interesting part. Al-Khatiri thinks that community Muslims, the folks really active in their religious communities, they're in a unique spot to lead this degrowth thing, especially in Muslim-majority societies.
Oh, interesting.
It's because of their strong community ties and shared values, you see. They're more likely to be open to these ideas. They really see how social, environmental, and spiritual well-being are all connected.
But wouldn't focusing only on religious communities be a bit limiting?
Yeah,
What about getting more people involved? You know, people who aren't necessarily religious.
that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Al-Khatiri's talking about community Muslims, but these ideas, degrowth and relocalization, they can resonate with anyone, you know.
Right.
If you care about sustainability and strong communities, it doesn't matter what your beliefs are.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Look at the transition town movement, for example.
Yeah.
Whole towns are working to be more self-sufficient and eco-friendly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening all over the world with all sorts of people.
That makes sense. So while faith can be a strong motivator, these ideas appeal to a much wider group.
For sure. It's about realizing we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
We have to find common ground to solve these problems.
Now, speaking of navigating different worlds, let's shift gears a bit and talk about white converts to Islam in Canada. Bullock's research really sheds light on their lives, especially this idea of liminal life.
Liminal life.
Yeah, it's that feeling of being caught between two worlds, never fully belonging to either.
Wow. Imagine being constantly between two cultures, getting questioned by both sides. That's what many converts go through.
Right.
On one side, they face Islamophobia from society. Some are even called race traitors.
Wow.
And on the other side, they have a tough time fully joining Muslim communities. Sometimes it's cultural differences. Sometimes they even face racism for the first time.
That's heavy stuff. It's
Yeah.
like always being in transition, never really finding solid ground.
Exactly. And this liminality, it's a real struggle. Bullock's research shows all sorts of ways these converts cope.
Oh, really?
Some find comfort in reciting verses from the Quran. They find strength in their faith. Others try to address assumptions head-on. Some even use humor to handle negative encounters. It's fascinating how they manage these complex situations.
While some individuals are navigating faith on the margins, others, like those in the Hizmet movement, have a more active, community-focused approach.
Oh, right, the Hizmet movement.
Yeah, can you tell us more about it and how it relates to this idea of civil Islam?
So the Hizmet movement, it's inspired by the teachings of Fethullah Gulen.
Right.
And it's a good example of what some call civil Islam.
Okay.
Unlike movements that focus on political power, Hizmet is all about service to others, education, talking between faiths, and working outside of government. Think of it like a network of places,
Okay.
like community centers, schools, and businesses, all promoting understanding and positive change from the ground up.
So it's more about building bridges and having conversations than fighting for power.
Yeah, exactly. Hizmet is about making positive change through community work and education.
Right.
They run schools that teach critical thinking and understanding between faiths,
Oh, that's good.
and they organize projects that address local needs. It's very hands-on, very community-driven.
So they're actually living their values.
Yeah,
But some people say that they're not getting involved in politics. It's a problem.
right.
They argue that it's not enough to deal with the deep-rooted injustices in the system. What do you think about that?
It's a fair point.
Yeah.
Promoting education and understanding is important, but it's also true that just avoiding politics isn't always enough.
Okay.
Systemic change often needs us to challenge those in power, push for new laws, and make sure those in charge are held accountable.
So it's this debate about what works better, working within the system or fighting against it.
Exactly. Both sides have valid points.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds us that there's no one solution that fits everything. The best way to create change depends on the situation.
Right.
Sometimes working within the system for slow change is best. Other times, you need to take direct action and shake things up.
This deep dive is really making us think.
It is, isn't it? It's all about understanding these complex issues. And that's what we're trying to do here. But before we jump into part 2, where we'll explore these ideas even more, let's take a moment.
Right.
What's sticking with you so far? What questions are coming up for you?
Good questions.
We'll be back soon to dive even deeper. Welcome back to our look at communities and Islamic values.
Before the break, we were talking about the Hizmet movement. It sounds like they're really putting their ideas into action, with their focus on education and community service. But I'm still thinking about what Al-Khatiri said about community Muslims taking the lead in this whole degrowth movement. What exactly does he mean by that term?
Well, Al-Khatiri, he kind of separates Muslims into two groups. You've got community Muslims, those who are super involved in their religious communities, always at the mosque, doing stuff together. And then there are non-community Muslims. They might consider themselves Muslim, but they're not as active in the community. He thinks that the community Muslims, because they have this strong sense of community and shared values, they're more likely to be into things like transition towns or eco-villages.
It's interesting that link he sees between being involved in a religious community and being open to degrowth ideas. Do you think that holds true outside of Islam, too? Like, could it apply to other religions or even secular groups?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to a bigger idea about shared values and working together to make change happen. Al-Khatiri is focused on community Muslims, but these principles, degrowth and relocalization, they can resonate with anyone, really.
Right.
It's for anyone who cares about sustainability, strong communities, and making sure everyone has a fair share. It doesn't matter what you believe in, it's about those shared goals.
So while faith can be a powerful motivator, the appeal of these ideas goes beyond just one belief system.
Exactly. Take eco-villages, for example. These communities, they're all about ecological living, sharing resources, and making decisions together. Some eco-villages might have a spiritual basis, sure, but lots of them are secular.
Really?
Yeah, driven by a commitment to the environment and social justice.
It seems like the common thread is community, a willingness to share, and focusing on well-being that's not just about, getting more stuff.
You got it. It's about shifting our thinking from me to we, recognizing that our personal well-being is tied to the well-being of our communities and the planet. It's all connected.
Now let's go back to something you mentioned earlier. The criticism of the Hizmet movement for staying out of politics. It's tricky, right?
Yeah.
Some argue that focusing on education and dialogue, while good, isn't enough to tackle those deep-rooted injustices baked into the system.
It's true. Promoting education and understanding between cultures is crucial, no doubt.
Right.
But we also have to acknowledge that just staying out of politics has its limits.
Okay.
Real systemic change often requires us to take on those power structures head on, to advocate for new policies and hold those in power accountable.
So it's that debate again, working within the system or fighting against it,
Right.
which is more effective.
That's it. And both perspectives have valid points.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that there's no magic solution that works everywhere. The best approach might change depending on what you're dealing with.
Okay.
In some situations, working within the system to bring about gradual change might be the most strategic way to go.
Right.
But in others, taking direct action and disrupting the status quo might be what's needed to dismantle those harmful structures.
It's all about finding that balance, right?
Exactly. We have to see the limitations of both purely secular approaches and purely religious ones. It's about finding that middle ground where faith and social action can work together. to create a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
That's a really great point.
Thanks.
It reminds me of engaged Buddhism, where practitioners are encouraged to, actually apply Buddhist teachings to social and environmental issues. It's not just about personal enlightenment. It's about actively trying to alleviate suffering and make the world a fairer place.
That's a perfect example. And it shows how faith communities can be strong forces for good.
Hmm.
It's not about pushing your beliefs onto others. It's about tapping into the values of compassion, justice, and recognizing our interconnectedness. These values are often at the core of religious teachings, and they can inspire action and help create a more equitable and sustainable world for everyone.
Now, I want to shift gears a bit and dive into this idea of degrowth.
Okay.
That's a word that can be kind of scary or misunderstood.
Yeah.
Can you break it down for us?
Of course. Degrowth basically challenges this idea that endless economic growth is the only way to progress and be happy.
Okay.
Instead, it advocates for intentionally reducing our material consumption and shifting towards a way of life that's more local, fair, and sustainable. Think of it as a planned and equitable downscaling of the economy, leading to a smaller environmental footprint and a more balanced distribution of resources.
So it's not about being anti-growth, but more about rethinking what growth means and realizing that our planet has limits.
You got it. It's about putting human well-being and ecological balance ahead of just accumulating stuff and profits. Degrowth recognizes that we can't keep consuming at our current rate without serious consequences for both people and the planet. It's a call to reevaluate our values, to prioritize what truly matters, like community, connection, meaning, and purpose, over just chasing after material wealth.
So how does this all connect to the big problems we're facing globally?
Right.
We're seeing rising inequality, climate change is getting worse, and there's this sense of disillusionment with the way things are. Does degrowth offer a way out of this mess?
Degrowth provides a framework for tackling these interconnected crises by challenging the very foundations of the system that created them.
Okay.
Our current economic model, it relies on never-ending growth, which means constantly extracting resources, producing goods, and consuming more and more. This is what's leading to climate change, depletion of resources, and a growing gap between the rich and the poor.
It's a system that's not just unsustainable, but also really unfair. We're consuming way more than our planet can handle, and only a few are benefiting, while most people struggle just to get by.
That's right. Degrowth proposes a different vision, one where we prioritize meeting everyone's basic needs, sharing resources, and living in harmony with nature. It's about creating a world that's fairer, where everyone has the chance to thrive, not just accumulate more stuff. Imagine a world where work is less about producing and consuming, and more about contributing to our communities and the planet.
Okay, yeah.
Imagine shorter work weeks, more time for leisure and connecting with your community, and focusing on the quality of life over just having more possessions.
It's definitely a vision worth working towards. Al-Khatiri specifically calls on Muslim intellectuals to engage with these degrowth ideas. Why do you think that's so important?
Muslim intellectuals, especially those who are deeply rooted in their communities, they can play a crucial role in bridging the gap between theory and practice.
Right.
They can help put these degrowth ideas into an Islamic context, highlighting the values of sustainability, social justice, and being responsible caretakers of the earth, values that are already present in Islamic teachings.
So it's about connecting these concepts to what Muslim communities already value and believe in, showing them that degrowth aligns with Islamic principles.
Exactly. It's not about forcing a new ideology on anyone. It's about finding harmony with existing values. Islamic teachings already emphasize things like zakat, giving to charity, and sadaqah, voluntary giving,
Right.
and ihsan, which means striving for excellence in all you do. All of these align with sharing, taking care of those less fortunate, and living in balance with creation.
Right.
Degrowth can be seen as a natural extension of these values, a way to put them into action on a societal level.
It's not about imposing a new way of thinking. It's about tapping into the wisdom and potential that's already there within these traditions to guide us towards a more sustainable and just future.
You said it perfectly. It's about recognizing that many of the solutions to the problems we face today are already present in our diverse cultures and traditions. It's about rediscovering these values and finding ways to apply them to the challenges of today.
Let's talk about some practical examples. We've talked about transition towns and eco-villages as models of relocalization, but what could this look like in Muslim-majority societies?
Imagine mosques becoming hubs for sustainable living,
Okay.
promoting community gardens, teaching energy efficiency, and how to reduce waste.
Right.
They could host workshops on things like permaculture, Islamic finance, and ethical consumption.
Right.
Think about Islamic schools including environmental education in their curriculums, inspiring the next generation to be stewards of the planet.
Those are great examples. It's about weaving sustainability into everyday life and communal spaces, using mosques and Islamic schools to reach a lot of people.
Exactly. And it's not just about adopting new practices, it's also about reviving traditional Islamic practices that promote sustainability,
Oh, okay.
like the emphasis on conserving water, living simply, and sharing resources. For example, the concept of sufficiency in Islam.
Right.
It encourages being content with what you have and discourages excessive consumption. This principle aligns perfectly with the whole degrowth philosophy.
It's like connecting the past to the present, finding solutions within our own traditions. There seems to be a lot of potential for Muslim communities to become leaders in the degrowth and relocalization movements.
Absolutely. By drawing on their faith, their strong community bonds, and their deep-rooted values, they can pave the way for a more just, equitable, and sustainable future for all.
Right.
And this leadership can inspire others, demonstrating that a different way of life is possible, one that prioritizes well-being, connection, and living in harmony with nature.
That's really inspiring. It gives me hope that we can actually turn things around and create a world that's both just and sustainable.
Me too.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier. The idea of liminal life that white converts to Islam in Canada experience. It's really fascinating, and I'd love to explore it further.
Yes, it really sheds light on the complexities of identity and belonging. Remember, these individuals are navigating multiple worlds, often feeling like outsiders in both their former communities and their newly adopted faith.
So let's talk about the challenges they face. We mentioned Islamophobia from the wider society, but what about within Muslim communities? What specific issues do they come up against?
Well, like we talked about earlier, some converts are labeled race traitors by individuals who see their conversion as a betrayal of their racial identity. Others struggle to fully integrate because of cultural differences. They might face language barriers, unfamiliar customs, or even subtle forms of prejudice.
Wow.
And they might encounter skepticism from some Muslims who question their sincerity or their reasons for converting.
It's like they're stuck between two worlds, facing suspicion from both sides.
Exactly. This can lead to feeling isolated, marginalized, and like you don't truly belong anywhere. Imagine trying to fit into your new community while being questioned about your authenticity and facing prejudice from your old community. It's a tough spot to be in.
That must be incredibly difficult to navigate. How do they cope with all these challenges? We briefly mentioned religious coping, advocacy, and avoidance, but could you go into more detail about these strategies and maybe give some specific examples from Bullock's research?
Sure. Religious coping is a powerful mechanism for many converts. They find comfort and strength in their new faith, using the teachings of the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad to help them through their struggles.
Can you give us an example of what that might look like in practice?
Absolutely. One of the people Bullock interviewed, named Viviana, said that she finds comfort in reciting specific verses from the Quran. She describes the Quran as a total solace that soothes her and brings her back to her purpose.
That's a beautiful example of how faith can provide comfort and guidance when things are tough. It's like finding an anchor in the middle of a storm.
It's a reminder that religious beliefs and practices can be incredibly powerful sources of resilience. They can help people cope with stress, adversity, and even discrimination. Faith can provide a sense of meaning, a framework for understanding difficult experiences, and a supportive community.
Let's move on to advocacy. What forms does this take for white converts to Islam in Canada?
Advocacy can involve a range of responses, from self-advocacy to engaging in preemptive talk and even taking part in activism.
Can you break those down for us?
Self-advocacy is about standing up for yourself when faced with discrimination or prejudice. For example, Sophia, another person in Bullock's study, shared that when she was verbally abused in public, she would fight back, using her Canadian voice to challenge those who tried to put her down.
It sounds like she refused to be silenced.
Exactly. She saw it as a form of resistance, a way of asserting her dignity and pushing back against Islamophobic stereotypes. She wasn't going to let anyone define her or control her experience.
Now, what about this preemptive talk?
Preemptive talk is about anticipating potential prejudice or misunderstandings and addressing them head-on. Rowena, another participant, said that she often finds herself throwing out information about her Canadian identity and her understanding of Islam to shut down negative assumptions before they can even start. She'll proactively explain that she was born and raised in Canada, chose to convert to Islam, and that her understanding of Islam is rooted in peace, justice, and compassion.
So it's about taking control of the narrative and challenging stereotypes before they have a chance to take hold, like proactively reframing the conversation.
Exactly. It's about being proactive in educating others and shaping perceptions. It's about refusing to let others define you or your faith based on their own limited understanding.
And lastly, what about activism? What forms does this take for white converts to Islam?
Activism involves engaging in efforts to promote understanding, challenge discrimination, and advocate for social justice. For example, both Sophia and another participant, Callum, talked about using their whiteness as a way to connect with non-Muslim audiences. They believed that their perspective as converts might be more readily accepted.
Right.
They felt their experiences could help break down stereotypes and foster greater understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims.
It's interesting how they're using their unique position to encourage dialogue and understanding. They're taking their lived experiences and turning them into something positive, something that can create change.
It shows the potential for converts to act as allies and advocates,
Mm.
bridging cultural divides and promoting harmony between faiths. They have a unique perspective that allows them to see both sides,
Yeah.
and they can use that to build bridges and create understanding.
These are all such powerful examples of how white converts to Islam are actively shaping their liminal lives, challenging discrimination, and standing up for themselves and their communities.
It's a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their commitment to their faith and values. They're not letting these challenges define them. They're using their experiences to try to make the world a more just and compassionate place.
Now, before we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, I want to touch on another coping mechanism that Bullock talks about: avoidance. It's a strategy that makes sense, but it's also complicated, right? It's natural to want to avoid situations that make you uncomfortable, especially when you're constantly dealing with prejudice and judgment.
Absolutely. Avoidance can take many forms, from withdrawing from social situations to consciously managing your behavior and the way you dress to minimize potential conflict.
Hmm.
It's a way to protect yourself from the emotional strain of prejudice and discrimination. For some converts, this might mean avoiding certain social gatherings where they anticipate feeling out of place or unwelcome.
Okay.
For others, it might mean choosing clothes that make them less visibly Muslim, hoping to avoid unwanted attention or harassment.
So it's a form of self-preservation in a world that can feel hostile at times.
Exactly. While avoidance can be a useful strategy in the short term, we have to remember that it can also lead to increased feelings of isolation and prevent individuals from truly embracing who they are. If you're constantly trying to blend in and not stand out, it can be hard to fully express yourself and live authentically.
It's a tough balancing act between protecting yourself and living a life that's true to who you are. How do you find that balance when you're constantly navigating these complex social dynamics?
It's a journey, and there's no simple answer. It's about finding what works for you, what helps you feel safe and whole, while also staying true to yourself. For some converts, that might mean finding a community of people who share their values where they can be themselves without fear of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
For others, it might mean getting involved in activism and advocacy, using their voice to challenge discrimination and create a world that's more inclusive.
That's why it's so crucial to create environments that are inclusive and supportive, where everyone feels safe and empowered to be themselves without being judged or discriminated against.
I completely agree. We need to build communities where everyone feels valued and respected, no matter their background, beliefs, or experiences.
Right.
This means challenging our own biases, learning about different cultures and faiths, and speaking out against discrimination whenever we see it.
Now, as we get ready to move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about the challenges of liminal life for white converts to Islam in Canada, but how do those experiences intersect with the bigger issues of race, identity, and belonging in a multicultural society?
That's a great question. It makes us consider how identity is formed in a world where traditional boundaries of race, religion, and culture are becoming more and more fluid.
Right.
And it's a question we'll keep exploring in the last part of our deep dive, so stick with us.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into community empowerment and Islamic values. Before the break, we were getting into the idea of liminal life, that feeling of being between two worlds. It seems like the experiences of white converts to Islam in Canada, they really challenge how we usually think about race, identity, and belonging in a society that's supposed to be multicultural.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to look at these issues. We often think of race and religion as separate things,
Right.
but the experiences of white converts, they show how much those two things can actually be intertwined.
It's like their conversion to Islam adds this whole other layer to who they are, and it can be both freeing and really difficult at the same time.
Exactly. On one hand, converting can be deeply personal, spiritual even.
Right.
It's a way to connect to something bigger than yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the other hand, it can also create a sense of not belonging. Like you don't fit in with your old community or even your family anymore.
And as we talked about, that feeling of not belonging can be made even worse by the challenges they face within Muslim communities.
Right.
They might run into cultural differences, language barriers, or even subtle forms of prejudice.
Yeah, it's like they're constantly navigating this minefield of expectations, always trying to figure out where they fit in.
So how do these experiences change our understanding of what it means to belong in a society that's supposed to be multicultural?
Well, I think it forces us to face how complicated identity really is,
Yeah.
especially in a world where those traditional lines between race, religion, and culture, they're getting blurrier and blurrier.
Okay, yeah.
We can't assume that everyone fits into these neat little categories based on race, religion, or culture. People are way more complex than that.
Right.
Their identities are fluid, they have many sides, and they're shaped by so many different things.
It's like a reminder that we should be curious about each other, try to understand each other, recognizing that everyone has their own unique story.
Exactly. Instead of putting people in boxes, we should be creating spaces where they can share their experiences, be themselves, and truly feel like they belong.
So it's not just about tolerance, it's about actually including and understanding people.
That's it. It's about recognizing how rich and diverse human experiences are and building a society that values and celebrates that diversity.
Now, I want to bring this all back to where we started and connect these ideas to the themes of degrowth, relocalization, and community empowerment. We've been mainly talking about these concepts in the context of Muslim-majority societies, but how do they relate to those bigger global challenges we're all facing?
Right.
It seems like climate change, social inequality, and that search for meaning, they're things everyone worries about no matter where they live.
You're absolutely right. Those challenges, they go way beyond national borders, cultures, and religions. We're all dealing with this together, and we need to figure out how to address them as a global community.
So how do these ideas, degrowth, relocalization, and community empowerment, how do they offer a way forward for everyone, not just people in specific faith communities?
Degrowth challenges that dominant idea that we need constant economic growth, which, let's be honest, is pushing our planet to its breaking point and making inequality worse. It's a call to prioritize well-being, not just accumulating stuff, and to create a way of life that's both fairer and more sustainable.
So it's about realizing that the system we have now isn't working and we need to find a different path.
Exactly. Relocalization, on the other hand, is about bringing power back to local communities. It's about self-sufficiency, resilience, and a stronger connection to the places we live. It's realizing that the answers to global problems often come from the ground up.
So it's about empowering communities to take charge of their own futures.
Exactly. And community empowerment, that's about recognizing that people and communities have the ability to drive change.
Right.
It's about fostering collaboration, innovation, and a sense of shared purpose.
So it's about tapping into all that collective wisdom and creativity humans have to create a better world.
Exactly. And we're seeing this happening already all over the world.
Really?
From the transition town movement to indigenous communities protecting their lands to urban communities starting gardens and food co-ops.
It's great that these initiatives are taking root, proving that change is definitely possible.
It reminds us that we're not helpless. We can make choices. And that together, our actions, even small ones, can have a real impact.
So what does this mean for our listeners? What can we actually do as individuals to help create a more just and sustainable future?
Right.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. I
Yeah.
feel both challenged and really inspired.
It all starts with awareness, you know? We need to learn about these issues, understand how our actions are all connected, and realize how our choices affect the world around us.
So it's about being mindful consumers,
Exactly.
thinking about where our food comes from, how our clothes are made, and where our energy comes from.
Exactly. And it's about getting involved in our communities, connecting with people who share our values, and supporting projects that align with those values.
Hmm.
Whether it's volunteering, advocating for change, or just talking to friends and family about these things.
Right.
Every action, even if it seems small, it can make a difference.
It's about realizing that we're not powerless. We have the ability to make a difference, and our collective actions can create a wave of change that transforms the world.
That's right. It's about taking back our power and recognizing that we're not just consumers.
Right.
We're creators, capable of building the future we want.
This deep dive has been such an amazing journey. So many thought-provoking ideas and inspiring examples. We explored the challenges and possibilities of communities taking charge. We dug into how complicated identity and belonging really are. And we saw how faith-based movements can help create a more just and sustainable world.
Hmm.
I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
It's been great exploring all these ideas with you. And I hope this has sparked something for our listeners, maybe even inspired them to think about what role they can play in creating a better future. We've talked about the importance of community, both within religious groups and beyond. We've discussed how powerful collective action can be and how individuals really can make a difference. But in the end, it all comes down to one question. How do we want to live?
Right.
What kind of world do we want to create for ourselves and for the generations that come after us? That's a powerful question to think about. It asks us to examine our values, our priorities, what we really want for the future. And it reminds us that each of us plays a part in shaping that future. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep working to make the world a better place.
Until next time.